Welcome to License to Bid CMMC 2.0. We hope you enjoy our presentation and stick around for a Q&A at the end.
So we're going to start off with a disclaimer that we do not represent the Department of Defense nor the Cyber Accreditation Body. We are participants in the ecosystem, and in accordance, we'll do our best to live up to the Code of Professional Conduct. Along with that, our title, License to Bid, is a play on words, but we want to be clear that the Department of Defense intends to require compliance with CMMC as a condition of a contract award. So technically, you do not need a license to bid. Today, we're going to be talking about a focus on the history of how those 13 highlighted words come into be and the background of why the DoD is moving towards third-party assessments.
This presentation is the first of a three-part series that we titled Technical Compliance. We hope you consider joining us later this summer for part 2, Assessments Are Forever, when we will walk through what to expect during the assessment process. And then we'll have our final presentation in the fall, POA and M of Solace, where we will walk through the more granular aspects of preparing for a CMMC assessment.
So allow me to introduce the team presenting today. I am Todd Stanton from eTactics, a software development company, and I'm joined by Mercy Komar, a risk consultant at L. Calvin Jones. Our subject matter expert is Sean Hassett, who leads the federal and government practice at Comply, a candidate third-party assessor organization pending their CMMC Level 2 assessment. Sean has 14 years of experience in the information security field and holds 7 current industry certifications. Sean doesn't watch a whole lot of TV, but when he does, he likes to watch James Bond movies.
We thought it would be fun to start with a clip from the 1989 Bond film, License to Kill, to get things started. Okay, Sean and Todd, where are these requirements coming from?
Well, I think we can trace the roots of CMMC all the way back to 2004, because shortly after the 9/11 terrorist attack, the government recognized that the executive branch agencies really lacked the ability to exchange information, which may have helped prevent those terrorist attacks.
That's right. So in December 2004, Congress passed the Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act. Among other things, created information sharing environments for agencies, allies, and private sector to exchange terrorist-related information.
What does terrorism information have to do with CMMC?
Well, the CMMC is about protecting information, namely controlled unclassified information, or CUI. The original definition of controlled unclassified information comes from a White House memo in May of 2008. In this memo, it was loosely defined as information not meeting to the standards required to be classified, but also important to national interest by law or privacy, requires protection against unauthorized disclosure. So this catch-all definition was supposed to replace patchwork of over 100 different policies and markings across the executive branch and standardize, these markings for the safeguarding and dissemination of terrorism information, and with these new information sharing environments. So some of you might be familiar with the CUI executive order. So Mercy, Can you explain the difference between, this White House memo and the executive order which established the CUI program?
Well, the Executive Order 13556 in November 2010 used the 2008 White House memo that was created to share terrorism information as the model for sharing all other forms of controlled unclassified information uniformly across federal agencies. The National Archives and Records Administration, or NARA, was put in charge of the program and tasked with providing guidance to private sector partners to implement safeguarding requirements when handling CUI. Todd, do you want to explain where these safeguarding requirements came from?
Absolutely. So in June of 2011, NARA published their initial implementation guidance that simply said these measures should be consistent with the federal requirements published by the National Institute for Standards of Technology, or NIST. Now, the NIST guidance at the time came from Special Publication 800-53. Now, since CUI was determined to have a moderate impact level, there were 262 controls prescribed in the moderate baseline to protect its confidentiality when it resided in federal information systems. But Sean, since these requirements are for federal systems, can you help explain how they became for non-federal systems?
Sure, Todd. So in order to safeguard these requirements to be implemented in a non-federal system, rules needed to be published in the Federal Acquisition Regulation, FAR, or agency-specific regulation like the Defense Supplement, DFARS. So in the same month that NARA released the guidance on implementing CUI executive order, the DoD published a proposed DFARS rule that would have required contractors to implement a tailored-down version of NIST 853. These 59 controls would have been the first requirements to safeguard unclassified DoD information in non-federal systems. So you might be wondering why the DoD is proposing a process to put these requirements into a contract in the first place.
Well, the proposed 2011 DFARS case, much like CMMC, was really an outcome of somebody else's risk assessment. So there was a publication by the Brookings Institute back in March of 2012 that talked about how the FBI was alarmed at the number of China-based cyber attacks targeting American corporations to steal military technology. Now, DoD realized that a lot of controlled unclassified information resided on non-federal systems within the defense industrial base, and China was leapfrogging decades of research and development by stealing it. So they started moving towards protecting it. So when did DoD start inserting these requirements into new solicitations? It took almost 30 months since the proposed 2011 rule for DoD to publish their final rule in November of 2013. And this created the DFARS Clause 252.204-7012 that we hear so much about today. Now, at the time, the scope was really limited to controlled technical information, which has military or space applications, stuff like blueprints, schematics, and drawings. They wound up settling on 60 controls tailored from NIST 853. And as proposals were solicited, contractors began self-attesting that they were meeting these enhanced cybersecurity requirements. Now, contracting officers were only advised to assess compliance after a contractor had reported some type of a cyber incident. And the cyber incident was not, in and of itself, interpreted as any evidence that the contractor had failed to meet the requirements. So they're really working on the honor system. Now, a lot of businesses that operate in the defense industrial base are small businesses. So, Mercy, did the government make any concessions to small businesses when they first launched this requirement?
No, if you go back to the 2013 final rule, you can read the DoD responses to all the public comments. In regards to cost concerns, DoD equated their new enhanced cybersecurity controls to ISO 27002 and said it was reasonable cost to implement because it was equivalent to this industry standard. Now, for small businesses who don't have cybersecurity resources, DoD said that was not a sufficient reason to allow a contract to fail to protect this information. Sean, can you explain why the DoD was not very accommodating?
Well, Mercy, from the Brookings Institute report from 2012, it hinted at gaps in our security that the adversaries were exploiting. So the extent of these exploits weren't realized until a much later time.
That's right. And in January 2015, German publication Der Spiegel published documents obtained by Edward Snowden that included a top secret presentation that showed China had stolen terabytes of data on the F-35 program from a Lockheed Martin subcontractor as early as 2007 and 2008.
China is rejecting claims that it stole designs for the most expensive fighter jet ever made. German magazine Der Spiegel has published several NSA documents that Edward Snowden leaked suggesting Chinese hackers stole information about the F-35 Lightning II program. A spokesperson for the Chinese Foreign Ministry called the accusations, quote, baseless in a press conference Monday, saying China is willing to work with all countries to ensure cybersecurity.
So, Sean, did DoD work with NIST when they created this list of 60 requirements? And why didn't NIST just write a separate version of 853 for non-federal systems?
They did, but the draft wasn't released until June of 2015. The special publication was called NIST 800 and 171, and it initially included 109 security requirements tailored from NIST 853 to protect the confidentiality of controlled unclassified information in non-federal systems. Here's a brief clip from one of the contributing authors, Ron Ross, on why this guidance was released.
Because I talked about the F-35 and the design documentation. How would you like to be an Air Force pilot knowing that that advanced tactical fighter, that design documentation now is in the hands of our adversaries, our enemy? What are they going to do? They're going to start working on a countermeasure, a weapon system that's going to take that plane out, and they will be years ahead. And so that puts our pilots and our military in great peril. That's why this is a national security problem.
So contractors were expected to start implementing NIST 800-171 all the way back in 2015?
No, not at that time. The DFARS 7012 did not yet point to the NIST 800 and 171, so contractors were still only expected to meet the initial 60 controls previously discussed from NIST special publication 853 that the DoD tailored to protect controlled technical information.
What were they waiting for?
Well, DoD would have had to go through another rulemaking process to amend that 252-204-7012 clause from the 60 controls to point to this new NIST 800-171 framework with 109 controls. Now, aside from the change in the number of security requirements, there's really a significant difference in the scope of information that was being protected as well. Remember, at the time, DoD was really only focused on controlled technical information and no other categories of CUI.
What was the reason they ultimately decided to protect all categories of CUI and not just the controlled technical information?
Well, the hack of the Office of Personnel Management in 2015 probably had something to do with it.
7% of Americans. That's how many people were affected by the hack on the Office of Personnel Management. OPM revealed Thursday the information of 21.5 million government employees was stolen in the hack, more than 5 times the number that was originally reported. The hackers gained access to social security numbers, health information, and financial data, but they also gained access to background checks and Standard Form 86, which includes information about family members, psychological health, drug use, and criminal history. In a blog post, OPM Director Catherine Archuleta said her department would provide identity theft protection for the victims, which is pretty common in hacks like this. It's what Home Depot did when hackers accessed the data of 53 million customers. And in the case of thieves getting a hold of credit card information, that might be enough. But the dominant theory right now is the attack didn't come from scammers, but from within the Chinese government. And that makes protecting the victims a lot more complicated. No one from the federal government has officially blamed China, but National Intelligence Director James Clapper called them a leading suspect last week. And according to some security experts, that could mean dangerous information about federal employees with security clearances is in the hands of a foreign government.
So let's talk about the implications of that data falling into the wrong hands. Just a few months after the OPM announcement, hackers leaked more than 25 gigs of user data from Ashley Madison, which was a dating website for men seeking extramarital affairs. So foreign spies can now cross-check who has a security clearance via the OPM breach with who was cheating on their wife via the Ashley Madison breach and identify a target for blackmail. So the OPM hack turned out to be really the crown jewels, a gold mine for any foreign intelligence service. And it made DoD realize that it was important to protect all forms of CUI, not just controlled technical information. So DoD issued an updated rule that referenced CUI and pointed to NIST 800-171.
Yes, the DoD published their first rule for DFARS case 2013 D018 in October 2016. Here, Ron Ross again, this time explains the weaponization of NIST Special Publication 800-171 through DFARS.
And when you have critical information, you have to do whatever it takes to protect it. And it's irrelevant how big the company is. It could be two people in the garage in MIT, and if they're working on stuff that's highly critical, we are going to have to protect that data wherever it is. And that may mean that they have to build that protection into the cost of the contract. In some cases, maybe the DoD is going to provide that protection for them. There's a lot of different ways where this protection can be deployed. But just because a company is small, and I know there are resource issues there's nobody denying the resources are an issue. But the information, you have to focus on that first. How critical is it? And how are we going to get the resources to protect it in whichever way we can? Because I guarantee you, in OPM, the cost of that breach is almost, you can't even determine the cost of that breach. Well, we know it's cost us about $500 million with a B dollars so far in the cleanup. Now, you could have built a highly functional, highly protected system at OPM for 1/10 of that cost, maybe 1/100th of that cost. Your cleanups are always more expensive. And sometimes you can't measure the devastation of a breach. Like OPM, you really can't measure how bad that is because the effects of that are going to be so long-standing and permeate in so many places. Losing advanced technology from the sub-program or the F-35, you just can't measure in value how critical that loss is. That's why we're here today.
So this rule updated the DFARS clause 252, 204, 7012 to protect all covered defense information, including CUI, and prescribed the use of NIST Special Publication 800-171 as the required controls for non-federal systems. Contract a year to implement these 109 requirements.
I thought NIST 800-171 had 110 controls.
Well, initially, the requirement to have a system security plan was listed as a control that was expected to be routinely satisfied without specification. So we're going to let Gary or Gus Gusini from the Institute for Defense Analysis explain why NIST changed it to an actual control requirement.
At DoD, we got endless number of questions about, okay, so I have to be FIPS compliant, but I have to patch this thing over here, right? So if I have to patch it over here, I have to break the FIPS compliant. What do I do? Well, that's a risk decision, but generally you patch. So how do I identify that, especially if it's part of it's a plan of action, but part of it can be documented in the system security plan. Or like the wireless example, I don't allow it, so I do I need the contracting officer to approve an alternative or not applicable as part of the DFAR rule if I don't allow it? No, just document it in the system security plan. And we found it very difficult to continue to say that when it wasn't really explicit in 171. The other issue that came up is the requirement in the DFAR that said you have to, the second iteration where we gave you 2 years, and it said you have to meet the requirements by 31 December. Right? So what happens on 31 December 2017 when people who had planned to meet it were going to find they weren't, and we had new entries. So part of this was if we had a system security plan, you could then document what you had done, what you hadn't done, and the POAM would then, the plan of action would explain when you were going to get it done. And that way you could actually meet the requirement, because the way it's worded in 171 is essentially 171 allows for that. You can have the plan reflects what you have met or what you are going to you're going to implement in the future. So we got past the 2017 deadline by putting in the SSP.
So in December of 2016, NIST issued the first revision of Special Publication 800-171, added the SSP as 110th control.
So how did the DoD know whether contractors are implementing these new requirements?
We're kind of the first level of compliance or understanding of the CUI of the CUI requirements is certification or representation. Entering into a contract with the government and certifying or representing that you are compliant with requirements in the contract, which would include the requirements of the CUI program. That would be the first level. The second is the government may request documentation. It may be part of the solicitation. It may be afterwards in order to validate that controls have been met. And this is where you can look at, we'd be requesting the SSP or plan of actions and milestone, or plan of actions as well for review. We encourage the government only to request it if they are actually going to proactively review it so that you don't waste time sending it to us, and that when we do review it, you have an idea of the fact that it's been reviewed by our office. The next level is validation, and this can take a lot of forms. It can include perhaps third parties. It can include on-site validation, remote access validation, additional documentation requests with a visit. There's a lot of different ways this can take, and agencies are encouraged to understand the costs and use a risk management approach to determining which level of oversight to conduct on their contracts. Agencies will be in charge of overseeing their contracts, and then based off of the quantity or quality of CUI or how that CUI is going to be used, they'll determine which level of oversight will most likely apply.
Why didn't DoD require a third-party certification?
Well, Mercy, it was considered, but we'll go back to Gus for his answer to the question because his answer is still relevant today.
There are a number of reasons. One, as she notes, that there is an internal requirement to assess it, and when you sign the contract, you're saying you meet the requirement. Another point is in all the other contract provisions we have in the DoD, we don't have somebody independently assess whether or not you meet, the Fair Labor and Standards Act or the Fair Pricing and all those other things. So why add it to this one? Aside from the fact that internally we're used under the RMF to do that, but then this isn't quite an RMF kind of situation. Third, there's been experience in the department in other areas where, and I think the term is creating a cottage industry of non-value added stuff, right? When we start to do that and say you have to find somebody else out there, then you create this whole little industry of folks who are doing that. And there's no basis for any trust in those folks because we have no mechanism for validating they actually know that they can do what they're doing. We also noticed, based on the scale that was talked about, 60,000 contractors, 1 million contracts, that this was not something the government could just say, we're going to do it, right? So that's being relooked. All this is being relooked at again because there is obviously desire for especially the high-risk situations to have a more positive understanding of what's actually there. So in the low risk, so there's, as noted, all CUI, even though it's moderate confidentiality, is not equal. I can have controlled technical data that's about the next generation flashlight that I really will trust the contractor to say he's protecting that data because its loss is not going to be that big a deal to me. In the medium category of a little higher risk, I may want to go actually look at the SSP and what your POEMs are doing. And from having looked at a number of those, you can tell almost right away that somebody knows what they're doing or don't know what they're doing. Now, they may have pencil whipped or use a Navy term, gun deck, what they say they're doing. But that's one indication. And then at the higher risk, you may actually want to go visit. And the department's still trying to figure out exactly how to do that.
So what happened to change the DoD's stance? The third-party certification assessments weren't needed.
Well, the first month the NIST 800-171 requirements went into effect, the Navy's plans for a supersonic anti-ship missile were stolen from a contractor working at the Naval Undersea Warfare Center.
China reportedly hacked a U.S. Navy contractor's computer and stole hundreds of gigs of data, including material about submarine warfare. The report comes from the Washington Post, and sources told the Post that Chinese hackers stole data from a secretive project called Sea Dragon, including plans for a supersonic anti-ship missile for U.S. submarines.
So, Mercy, let me ask you this question. How many contractors do you think were even aware of these new requirements when they first came out in early 2017?
The National Defense Authorization Association published a white paper in July of 2018, which surveyed 227 organizations that manufacture supplied components and services to the DoD. Their findings revealed that only 64% of the respondents were aware of the new DFARS requirements, 60% had read the DFAR requirements, 55% had read through the NIST guidance special publication 800-171, and only 40% had a clear understanding of the NIST guidance. Sean, when did DoD start talking about verifying these requirements at a time the contract was awarded?
Well, Mercy, it was in March of 2019 when MITRE published a report called Deliver Uncompromised that recommended the DoD consider evaluating the cybersecurity of prime acquisition metric above the cost of schedule and performance, and that the DoD consider enabling contractors to earn some type of verified cyber resilience status. Todd, do you know if the DoD ever measured the adoption of DFARS requirement along the defense industrial base?
Well, a few months after MITRE's report, DoD Inspector General published their own review after auditing the protection of CUI and contractor-owned systems. At a high level, the report found that contractors were not consistently implementing controls, and contracting officers from DoD were not verifying the NIST standards prior to contract award, and DoD wasn't even marking CUI, let alone notifying contractors when it was being provided to them. So this all put CUI at high risk for compromise from a cyber attack when it resided on these contractor-owned information systems. Now, the report was based on an extremely small sample size. We're only talking about 9 contractors who had active contracts involving CUI, but the findings were pretty startling. 2 out of 9 didn't have physical security controls. 7 out of 9 weren't using multi-factor authentication for network access. And 8 out of 9 didn't limit the unsuccessful logon attempts. So, Mercy, what do you think Congress thought when they reviewed this Inspector General report?
Well, I know that at the end of 2019, Congress stepped in using the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2020 and called for requirements to be imposed on the defense industrial base for the purpose of assessing the cybersecurity of individual contractors. And they recommended the Secretary of Defense consider including third-party certifications, such as the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. Is this where the CMMC requirement is coming from?
No, the CMMC was codified through DFARS Case 2019 D041, published in November of 2020. The plan was to have contractors certify at 3 distinct levels based on the type of information they were handling. Level 1 was intended to meet the basic security requirements of FAR 52-204-21 that would be required by any contractor or supplier handling federal contract information. The next certifiable level would have been level 3, which was including the requirements of NIST Special Publication 800-171, plus 20 additional practices that would be intended for contractors or suppliers handling controlled unclassified information. The last level of certification was level 5, which was reserved to the top 200 to 300 prime integrators would require that level of certification. In this incremental of certification levels, levels 2 and 4 were in scope, but they weren't considered certifiable. They were more stepping stones between the 3 main levels. So at the time, this interim rule contained 3 new DFARS clauses. So clause 7019 required contractors to submit a self-assessment score of NIST Special Publication 800-171 no less than every 3 years into the Supplier Performance Risk Management System. The next clause, 7020, permitted the government to access the organization's facility or conduct a higher level assurance assessment that would require contractors and supplier to show that they have a current SPRS score and that they're maintaining the controls. And then finally, DFARS clause 7021 would require all contractors, except those providing commercial off-the-shelf products, to provide some level of certification assessed by a third party who would verify that the controls were implemented and had been implementing for an extended period of time. So at the beginning of CMMC, the phases were intended to be rolled out over a period of 5 years while they were building the ecosystem of third-party assessor organizations to service the 80,000 contractors and suppliers. So is there a rush today to go out and prepare for CMMC when the intention is to roll this out over a 5-year period?
Well, Sean, I would say there's 2 reasons to implement these controls. First, you want to be compliant and maintain your license to participate on DoD contracts. But second, these are the best published guidelines that NIST has produced to protect the confidentiality of information. And I would cite a statistic that says 60% of small businesses who suffer a cyber attack close their door within 6 months. Now, 1 month after the CMMC interim rule was published, this happened.
Information technology company SolarWinds was found to be the target of a massive cybersecurity attack in December. The company's Orion software had been compromised, and the breach went undetected for at least 9 months. It had exposed 18,000 computer networks around the world to malicious code. The hackers used a supply chain attack to send a virus into the system, which spread to the company's clients through software updates that created a way for them to gain access to sensitive data.
Imagine almost a secret door into your house, and the first thing that happens when they come through that secret door is all your keys are right there. They just grab them, and now they can get into any locks you have in your house.
The president of Microsoft called it the largest and most sophisticated attack the world has ever seen.
When we analyzed everything that we saw at Microsoft, we asked ourselves, how many engineers had probably worked on these attacks? And the answer we came to was, well, certainly more than 1,000.
Now, at the time, experts were referring to this SolarWinds as the new OPM hack. But as the world moved into the COVID era, the frequency and impact of cybersecurity attacks began to accelerate, really at an unprecedented pace. So in May, Colonial Pipeline was forced to stop the supply of gasoline on the East Coast due to a ransomware attack. That same month, JBS, the world's largest meat processing company, shut down operations until they agreed to pay an $11 million ransom to decrypt their systems. Just 2 months later, Kaseya suffered a supply chain attack that passed ransomware down to managed service providers and customers using their virtual systems administrator tool. According to Checkpoint Research, 2021 saw a 50% increase in the number of attacks on corporate networks. And IBM reported that the cost per data breach had increased 10% to the highest cost ever at $4.24 million per breach.
So in the face of increased threats, why did the DoD appear to backpedal from the CMMC 1.0 requirements when they released 2.0 in November of 21?
So we've basically seen the likelihood of cyber attacks approach a point of certainty. In the face of this unstoppable adversary, the focus should really be on mitigating the impact. So CMMC 2.0 is all about DoD's attempt to focus on protecting what matters most. For example, if you don't have control on classified information and you only deal with federal contract information, under CMMC 2.0, you can continue to self-attest. DoD is not going to expend resources on certifying your environment. There's also a discussion ongoing to bifurcate level 2 and require third-party assessments only for CUI that's deemed critical to national security, allowing handlers of less critical CUI to continue to self-assess. Now, DoD has also aligned level 2 with NIST Special Publication 800-171 and level 3 with Special Publication 800-172, which focuses on enhanced controls to protect against advanced persistent threats, such as Russia and China.
But a few months after the CMMC 2.0 announcement, Russia invaded Ukraine. What roles that played in this conflict?
Well, as expected, Russia combined their military and intelligence operations with a series of cyber attacks. About a month before the attack, Whispergate, which closely resembled the 2017 encryption malware NotPetya, was found circulating in Ukraine by researchers. In the days leading up to the invasion, a series of distributed denial of service attacks took down banking and Ukrainian government websites. On the day of the invasion, hackers crippled satellite communications in Ukraine and other European countries. There are undoubtedly attacks that were thwarted or not publicized, but we were unable to fully defend Ukraine's critical infrastructure. And so there's an increasing threat that this conflict in Ukraine will spread and bring NATO into direct confrontation with Russia. And as terrifying as a war with a nuclear-armed adversary is, that isn't the threat that the U.S. is worried about most. So China has pledged reunification with Taiwan before 2049. And many military analysts believe that by 2030 or even 2035, China will have the warfighting capacity to conduct their own special military operation. An expanding war in Europe might accelerate that timeline. But China appears to be the larger threat for DoD. So Sean, what happens next?
Well, Todd, we face an increasingly increased amount of capable threats. NIST has said that they will release revision 3 of NIST 800 and 171 at some point this year in 2022. Since CMMC 2.0 now points to NIST Special Publication 801, any updates to revision 3 will drive new requirements for CMMC. Much of what we've heard at this time for the upcoming revision of NIST may include those Delta 20 controls that were a part of CMMC 1.0. They might come back in this special publication 800-171 revision 3. So by reverting back the CMMC framework to focus on NIST special publication 800-171, the DoD has largely left the security requirement selection and tailoring up to NIST. So Todd, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on how you expect the DoD to issue the final rule.
Well, I expect the DoD will publish the final rule sometime between May 2023 and December 2024, and then start inserting these new requirements into solicitations shortly thereafter. DoD solicitations with CMMC requirements are typically awarded 6 to 12 months after they're put out to bid. And since certification is expected to be required at the time of contract award, DoD contractors and suppliers should realistically expect to have their certification prior to November or December of 2023, or be at risk of not being awarded contracts they otherwise would have won. We don't anticipate that the CMMC ecosystem, that would be the assessors and the certified third-party assessor organizations, will be at scale to assess and certify anything close to the 80,000 companies in the first year. But early adopters who can demonstrate certification will benefit during this early evaluation period of new solicitations, while those who wait will compete for a increasingly limited amount of resources to prepare and certify under the CMMC requirements. So companies who have their house in order today can participate in an upcoming voluntary assessment program, which we will discuss more in our next session.
Well, guys, we've covered a lot here today. Can you give me a summary of what we've discussed?
Well, since 2011, the Department of Defense has tried to secure sensitive information within the defense industrial base. They didn't want to create a third-party assessor, but the self-attestation process didn't work. The threats are increasingly exponential, and the continued loss of critical data is not sustainable. The DoD has determined the best way to reduce the risk is to institute a third-party assessment. So hopefully in this presentation today, we'll be able to see the pattern that led us to CMMC.
So what can companies watching this today do to prepare?
Well, companies can take the following 5 steps to prepare for certification. Step 1 would be determine the maturity level that they need of CMMC. And within that maturity level of CMMC, they can identify the FCI, the federal contract information, and the COI, controlled unclassified information, they have in their environment. That'll give them an indication of what maturity level they want to be at. Next, the organization seeking certification need to understand that the certification process is a marathon, not a sprint. The minimum time window for certification is 6 to 12 months to get ready. However, it could take longer to prepare and become fully certified. Next, the use of a team versus a single person trying to obtain certification on their own is critical, especially in the field of cybersecurity. It's very rare you find somebody who could be an expert in everything. A lot of times you need a lot of experts to give you a complete picture of what's going on and suggestions and how to move forward. Lastly, by determining the maturity level you need, identifying the data flow of FCI and CUI, you can figure out the scope of what your assessment should look like. The CMMC accreditation body has released a supplemental guide for scoping that gives you some guidance on people, technology, and locations that you may want to consider into the scope of your certification process. So at this point, I think a good way to summarize this up is, as of October 2021, there were 33 third-party organizations seeking to become assessor organizations. At that point, 21 of the 33 assessor organizations failed the level 2 assessment. So I think what we're trying to quantify here is individuals that are well-staffed and that are experts in cybersecurity are finding obtaining CMMC certification very challenging. So in Todd's recommendation, why wait? Get started today.
And so on that note, there's a couple places that we'd like to offer up as good resources to visit. So first, the DoD has all their official documentation related to the current model published on the website for acquisition and sustainment under the Undersecretary for Defense. Next, you can find Comply Attestation on the CyberAB ecosystem and reach out to consultants there to assist in implementing or documenting the required security controls. And lastly, Project Spectrum is a DoD-funded website that provides tools and advice to DoD contractors and suppliers. They have a tools review section where you'll find eTactics K2 compliance solution, along with other products that have been reviewed by DoD cybersecurity professionals.
Getting back to our theme, here's a clip that summarizes in a fun way some of what we covered today.
Ok, que pase.
Well done, Franz. Another $80 million write-off.
I guess it's time to start cutting overhead.
Ah!